مساء الخير عليكم. Um, so we meet again through a different medium, without any direct interaction. I hope you kind of enjoy this experience, because to me you have transformed into a virtual audience. There is no stimulating intellectual exchange of ideas. Now, let us start this lecture. In the previous lectures, we have covered the first unit in our course about the main intellectual traditions of studying political authority in the Muslim civilization. The first tradition was that of al-siyasa al-shar'iyya, that we reviewed through the work of Ibn Taymiyyah, السياسة الشرعية في إصلاح الراعي والرعية. And we have dealt with this tradition kind of extensively. And then the second tradition, the sultanistic literature, Al-Adab al-Sultaniyya, and we have seen a sample of that tradition in Abu Hamid al-Ghazali's work At-Tibr al-Masbuk fi Nasihat al-Muluk. And then the third tradition of political philosophy, as manifested through the classical work of Abu Nasr al-Farabi, السياسة المدنية أو مبادئ الموجودات. There are other traditions of studying political authority in the Muslim civilization, like that of the theory of al-imama in Muslim theology. Also, there were attempts to study and analyze political authority in the fields of Quranic studies, hadith studies, that is to say the prophetic tradition, in history and in literature. But there is actually no time to deal with all these traditions. These traditions form the intellectual background against which the attempt of Ibn Khaldoun to theorize about politics. I was saying that the art of political theorization in the thought of Ibn Khaldoun, or Ibn Khaldoun's contribution in the art of political theorization, can only be understood against the background of all these intellectual traditions. Now let us talk about Ibn Khaldoun. Ibn Khaldoun is one of the most studied thinkers in the Muslim civilization, to the extent that we cannot make a survey of the studies on Ibn Khaldoun and his works. It is impossible to survey all these works, whether in the East or in the West, in English, in French, or in Arabic, or in any other language. This is an advantage and a disadvantage at the same time, because as Ibn Khaldoun is one of the most studied thinkers, he is also one of the most misunderstood thinkers. And that is because everyone can find an evidence of an idea of his in the works of Ibn Khaldoun. Any person can quote Ibn Khaldoun, can extract and cite a certain paragraph from the work of Ibn Khaldoun to support his opinion and his ideas. The French thinker Maxime Rodinson, who wrote this work, Islam and Capitalism, talked about Karl Marx, and he said that Karl Marx can be read in different ways, and people can find texts and quotations in the works of Karl Marx that would support their ideas. And the same thing is actually valid for Ibn Khaldoun. Part of the problem about reading Ibn Khaldoun is that there are too many vague statements in his works. There are also terms that were left undefined. And there are certain linguistic constructions, sentence constructions, that would lend themselves to different interpretations. And the problem about reading Ibn Khaldun is that people actually impose their own ideas, impose their own problems, impose their own questions arising from their present on the text of Ibn Khaldun. And they thought that Ibn Khaldun was actually writing his works in order to deal with their problems, the problems of their eras, not the problems of his own age. And as such, they actually displaced the text of Ibn Khaldun. They twisted the meanings of the words of Ibn Khaldun. If you remember, for instance, we talked about the notion of the state, and we said that what Ibn Khaldun meant by the state is what we call right now form of government or political regime. But when people read the works of Ibn Khaldun and they found the term state, they imposed the idea of or the modern notion of state on the work of Ibn Khaldun. As such, his work appeared in different light, and they obscured the work of Ibn Khaldun, and they made his ideas very vague and very confused and disturbed. So, in fact, when we read a certain thinker, we're not supposed to impose our ideas on him. We're not supposed to locate him in our own context, but we are supposed to locate him in his own context, in his socio-historical context, in his cultural context. When we find terms in his texts, even if he left those terms undefined, we actually are supposed to define them the way these terms were defined in his age, in his time, not in our time. Some people might think when we drag the ideas of a certain thinker to our present, and when we redefine his terms and his concepts the way we used to define them in our present, we are actually throwing new light on these texts. Actually, we are not throwing new light. We are obscuring these texts. These texts are supposed to be located in their times, in their contexts, whether we're talking about the intellectual, cultural context or the socio-historical and economic context. Now, what is actually the importance of the ideas of Ibn Khaldun? The importance of the ideas, or the relevance of the ideas of Ibn Khaldun to our present is that his ideas are part of universal legacy, in the sense that many of the problems that we are witnessing in our present, for instance, the civilizational deterioration, the cultural ossification, the spread of imitation, the spirit of defeat, political disintegration, social fragmentation, all these phenomena that belong to our present actually had their starting point in the time of Ibn Khaldun. And actually he was a witness of several historical turning points in the history of the Arab Islamic civilization. And he observed very well these turning points and wrote about them in his introduction. He talked about how the universe started stagnating and everything became deteriorating and confused. As such, Ibn Khaldun, when he is responding to the problems of his own present, he is actually addressing the initial beginnings of the problems of our own present. Hence, the importance or relevance of the works of Ibn Khaldoun to our own context. So actually studying the works of Ibn Khaldoun would contribute not just to understanding the present of Ibn Khaldoun, but to understanding our own present. Another important thing related to Ibn Khaldoun's art of political theorization is that his works present us with a unique understanding of what theory is about. Usually, people understand theory as a group of abstract statements related to a certain object of study. But that is not it. That is not theory. A theory is actually a formulation of the experience, the suffering of a certain thinker, the spirit of a certain age in which a certain thinker lived. As such, the theory or the theorization of Ibn Khaldoun reflects his own historical experience, reflects the spirit of his age. Actually, the spirit of the age is an English translation to the German concept Zeitgeist. Zeit is time, Geist is soul or spirit. So the theory always reflects the suffering and experience of a certain thinker, and also reflects the manifest features of his own times. Now we need to ask ourselves, what was Ibn Khaldoun? Ibn Khaldoun, although he was counted as the first Arab sociologist, Ibn Khaldoun was a historian. And he was the head of a very unique school of Muslim historiography. You remember when we dealt with the text of Al-Maqrizi, and we talked about the intellectual traits of Al-Maqrizi and his method, the purpose of history, his definition of history. All this comes from Ibn Khaldoun, who was actually his teacher. Ibn Khaldoun was a very unique historian, and he was very much different from those historians who preceded him in time. It is not that he sought to confirm the factuality of historical events, but he provided the events of Muslim history with a philosophical framework. That is to say, he gave events a meaning. He gave events form, direction, and basis. As such, he gave a logic, or actually he extracted the logic of the turn of events in Muslim history. That was the main contribution of Ibn Khaldoun in the field of Islamic history. And as such, he actually delved through Ilm al-Umran, or what we call social science or sociology nowadays. Apart from the theoretical framework of Ibn Khaldoun, we find that he used very unique units of analysis, and that is manifest in this term al-Asabiyya. Ibn Khaldoun was actually the first one, as far as I know, who used the term al-Asabiyya to analyze event, social and historical phenomena. He talked about al-Asabiyya as a social actor, as a political actor, as a military unit, as a key to understanding different historical events and different problems. Now, with this understanding of the relationship between theory and context, and how a certain context defines the horizon of a certain theory or certain theorist, and how the theory would open new ways for a certain context. It is out of the question that we might be able to understand the thoughts or ideas of Ibn Khaldun without dealing with his times, without dealing with his historical context. The century in which Ibn Khaldun lived was actually the 8th Hijri century, or the 14th AD century. And this century, this era, was actually characterized by retreat, and it was characterized by deterioration. Retreat and deterioration was the title of the historical context in which Ibn Khaldun was born, in which Ibn Khaldun lived, in which Ibn Khaldun studied and received knowledge, in which Ibn Khaldun grew into a very clever and intelligent politician and a very incisive thinker. That era, as we said, was characterized by deterioration, and it was characterized by retreat on the civilizational level. In this century, we found that Baghdad, the capital of the eastern part of the Muslim civilization, fell a century ago under the feet of the Mongols. We found the diminishing areas of Muslim rule in Andalusia. So Muslim rule in Andalusia was confined to Granada and the surrounding regions, east and south. Also, this era was characterized by the permanency of wars, the permanency of conspiracy. The rise and fall of states was a dominant feature of this era. And also plagues and famines were also a salient feature of this era. If you remember the text of Al-Maqrizi, he always dealt with famines, he always dealt with very bad times. He always dealt with plagues, and Al-Maqrizi picked this as a topic for his own text because, I mean, these were the events that were happening in his times, and he picked his object of study from the problems of his own context. So that was a dominant feature of the same era in which Al-Maqrizi and Ibn Khaldun lived. And Ibn Khaldun was actually aware of the kind of deterioration, the kind of dissolution taking place in his present. And in his own text, he talked about plagues, he talked about the collapse of civilization, he talked about corruption, he talked about people fleeing and leaving their lands, he talked about the destruction of countries, although he was aware that the share of the western part of the Muslim world was much bigger than the share of the eastern part of the Muslim world in this sort of deterioration and destruction. Now, this was actually a historical fact. Not only Ibn Khaldun noticed this, but one contemporary to us, French thinker, his name is Jack Burke, he said that this era was actually one of the worst eras ever to be known by the civilizations of the Mediterranean. So the salient feature of this era was actually retreat and deterioration. How can we understand this? Retreat and deterioration actually covered all fields of life in the western part of the Muslim world, Al-Maghrib al-Kabir, as it was called at that time, which includes what we call Libya, Tunisia, Algeria, Morocco nowadays. Now, politically, we find that this deterioration reflected itself in the collapse, or let us say disintegration, of the major political units that were actually carrying the entity of the Muslim civilization. Now, the Muslim civilization lost its political unity after, 2 centuries after the immigration of the Prophet. So there were actually major political units actually preserving the unity of the Muslim world. In the era of Ibn Khaldoun, these major political units were collapsing, were disintegrating. So we find, for instance, that in the East, Baghdad fell under the feet of the Mongols. That was actually a terrible and catastrophic event, because the Abbasid Caliphate actually was the carrier of cultural progress, of intellectual enlightenment, of political influence, of economic prosperity in large areas of the Muslim world, and it continued for about 6 centuries. It fell in 656 of Al-Hijra. And after its fall, it turned into a nominal caliphate, in the sense that the person of the Khalifa had absolutely no authority, and he was invited to stay in Egypt in order for his name to be called in Friday prayers, and in order to be coined, his name to be minted on the coins in Egypt. And that would lend kind of legitimacy to the Mamluk rulers of Egypt. But he practiced absolutely no authority. And that was the end of the great Abbasid Caliphate. Now, the Mongols ruled large areas of the Abbasid Caliphate, and the area of influence took the form of a crescent. Its upper horn was parts of what we call now Turkey and parts of India, and its bottom was Iraq and Iran. So here we see that the Mongols ruled large areas belonging to the Muslim world. In Asia Minor, we find the Turks, who are trying to expand their area of influence and fighting Eastern European kingdoms. Also in Egypt, we find the Mamluk state that ruled Egypt, large parts of Syria, and also large parts of Arabia, that region of Al-Hijaz that contains the holy shrines in Mecca and Al-Medina. In the western part of the Muslim world, the story was worse and more dangerous. The Muslim rule in Andalusia was shrinking every day, until it was confined to the city of Granada and the areas surrounding it to the east and to the south, under the dynasty of Bani al-Ahmar. And that state was struggling to preserve its existence under the heavy attacks of the Spaniards, who were seeking to unite Spain under a Christian leadership. In Al-Maghrib al-Arabi al-Kabir, what we call Morocco, Algeria, and Tunisia right now, we find Dawlat al-Muwahhidin. It was one of the great states that tried to unite all these areas under its rule, but we find that it was living under abnormal conditions, and that the rulers of its regions were actually tyrannizing the local population. We also find that Dawlat al-Muwahhidin went to war with a very famous tribe in the southern part of Morocco called Bani Murrain, and the wars between Dawlat al-Muwahhidin and Bani Murrain continued for about 50 years. 50 years of tribal wars until Dawlat al-Muwahhidin collapsed. So here you see that there is total lack of political unity in the Muslim world, especially the western part of the Muslim world in which Ibn Khaldoun was living and in which he was moving and practicing politics. Now, we said that Dawlat al-Muwahhidin was living under abnormal political conditions. Now, try to imagine this with me. In Tunisia, it was under the rule of Al-Hafsiyin. Algeria was under the rule of Bani Abdel Wad. Marrakesh, that is the northern part of Morocco, was under the rule of Al-Muwahhidin. Al-Maghrib al-Aqsa, that is the southern part of Morocco, was under the rule of Bani Murrain. Bani Murrain wanted to sweep the areas under the rule of Al-Muwahhidin. So they were always fighting Al-Muwahhidin. As such, Al-Muwahhidin, they allied themselves with Bani Abdel Wad in Algeria. So every time Bani Murrain pushed Al-Muwahhidin to a tribal war, Al-Muwahhidin with their allies Bani Abdel Wad in Algeria, they fought Bani Murrain. And in order to save their skin, Bani Murrain, they allied themselves with Al-Hafsiyin in Tunis, who every time there was a war between Bani Murrain and Al-Muwahhidin, they fought Bani Abdel Wad in Algeria. So you find here that the ruling dynasty in four places were always fighting one another. So every state was an enemy to its direct neighbor and was an ally to the state, to the other state next to it, not directly, but after it. And this led the whole region to live into endless wars, non-ending wars, were actually the marking feature of this region politically. Now, that is exactly the political context in which Ibn Khaldoun lived. And he started his career as a secretary for the Prince of Tunisia. And then he moved to Bani Murrain in the city of Fas. And then he crossed the sea to go to Andalusia and work for the Prince of Granada. And then he returned to Algeria to work for the Prince of Begaia. And then he moved to another region in Algeria, of the region of Tilmisan. And then he returned to Fas with Bani Murrain. And then he went to Tunisia on his way to Egypt. And when he heard that Tamerlane was actually sacking cities in the Levant, that is to say, the greater Syria, what we call right now Syria, Lebanon, Jordan, and Palestine. When he heard that Tamerlane is sacking all these areas, he left Egypt and he went to meet Tamerlane, and actually he recorded his meeting with Tamerlane and everything that he said to Tamerlane and everything Tamerlane said to him in one of his works called The Voyages of Ibn Khaldoun, East and West. After having met Tamerlane, he returned to Egypt, where he was appointed to be one of the grand judge of Al-Maliki legal school before he died. Now the question we need to ask ourselves, why was this region and why was this era characterized by political turbulence? And this takes us to the second aspect of this historical context, which is the social aspect. Now, the social aspect of this historical context deals with the social structure of the region. Now, every country, every city, every place is composed of a group of people, a group of individuals. Now, what form would this group of individuals take? And here, the key feature socially of this region is the tribe. The tribe in the western part of the Muslim world, as well as in the eastern part of the Muslim world, was a key social, political, and military actor. What is a tribe? The tribe is actually a social unit, those individuals related to one another by relations of kinship, blood, and marriage. And the master of the tribe, the chief, the tribal chief, he commands the loyalty of the members of the tribe. He is the only one who is obeyed in the tribe. As such, the tribe isn't only a social unit, but it is a political unit of its own. Unlike the condition in the modern state, where certain individuals were licensed to bear arms, what we like the security forces, like the army forces nowadays, in the tribes, all male members of the tribe were allowed to bear arms. You remember those photos coming from Yemen with people bearing daggers in their waists. So the number of strong young men bearing arms is the measure of the military and political might of the tribe. And if the number of those warriors of the tribe increases, it means that the tribe has a bigger army and is capable of expanding and extending its areas of political influence, imposing its rule on neighboring tribes, holding alliances with other tribes. As such, Ibn Khaldoun noted that those armed young men of the tribe are like the walls of cities and regions. The tribe was a moving army, and its army was always ready to fight. Otherwise, the tribe will fall under the feet of invaders. Now, with every region composed socially of different tribes, the marking feature of life was tribal wars. Tribal wars was the dominant feature of life. It was part of everyday life of the individuals for several reasons, among which is the natural geographic reason. After all, the tribe as a social unit, it needs a kind of economy to provide its members with living. And how could this be? The tribe needs fertile land. The tribe needs water in order to raise animals or in order to cultivate this land. And it happens all the time that the rains would stop falling, drought would happen, or the plants on which animals feed would simply vanish. So what would the tribe do? The tribe was always on the march, trying to explore new lands, trying to capture and seek new lands. But we cannot expect that these new areas are no man's land. They belong to another tribe. So hence we will find the tribe seeking land would go to war with the tribe that is trying to preserve its own lands. This tribe is trying to preserve its life by seeking new land, and that tribe is trying to preserve its life by protecting its own land. And it was inevitable that both tribes would go to war with one another. It was kind of a struggle for survival. Another factor which led to the tribal wars was the organizational and political factor. These tribes were actually separate units, independent political units. We said that the tribal chief commanded the authority in the tribe, and he also commanded the loyalty of the members of his tribe. As such, there wasn't really a political authority practiced from above on him or his tribe. The tribe paid no taxes to the political authority. It was under no political obligations. It was under no surveillance. And any political authority sufficed itself by the tribal chief declaring his loyalty to the state, declaring his loyalty to the prince or the ruler. So a declaration of loyalty was actually more than enough. At certain times, the political authority delegated some authorities to the tribe to collect donations, to collect taxes from neighboring tribes in return to giving certain freedoms and certain privileges to the tribal chief, or sometimes in return to the tribal chief providing the central authority with fighters. If you remember, in these days there were no standing armies based on the principle of obligatory recruitment. But every tribe had its own warriors, and the central authority was nothing but a tribe or a coalition of tribes having its own warriors. So when this ruling authority went to war with other tribes, it needed more warriors. As such, it had to seek the warriors of other tribes who would join its own warriors just in this or that battle until the war ends, and those warriors would go to their own tribes. As we said, there were no standing or professional armies. Now, we talked about the tribe as a political and social unit. We talked about the tribal wars as the marking feature of the everyday life. Now, the state itself was actually a tribal state. We are not talking about the central state. We're not talking about the modern state that we know nowadays, the state that commands the loyalty of its citizens, the state that practices authority on every individual. But here, the tribal state doesn't deal with individuals directly, but it only deals with the major social unit of the tribe. So the state, which is nothing but a tribe or a coalition of tribes or part or a branch of a certain tribe, subjugating other tribes, so that central authority, that tribal authority, was actually ruling tribes. But within every tribe, the tribal chief was actually practicing authority upon the members of the tribe. In this way, the tribes were actually sort of a buffer between the central authority and the individuals. Actually, if you remember modernization theory, they always talked about this thing as a kind of disadvantage. But in the light of the amplification of the authorities of the modern state. We find that in several tribal societies, like the Gulf societies, these tribal entities, they actually provide protection to their members. They guarantee a minimum level of rights and freedom that the central authority of the state cannot violate. So they actually, in the context of nowadays, this is a kind of advantage, not a disadvantage at all. Now, if the tribal state is a tribe, branch of a tribe, a coalition of tribes subjugating other tribes, that doesn't make the political situation stable, but it makes it very fluid and actually very explosive. Because political stability, or the stability of the rule of a certain tribal chief, depends on two factors. It depends on maintaining the internal solidarity of the ruling tribe, and it also depends on maintaining the alliance between the ruling tribe and other tribes. And that was something very difficult, and that was something very fluid, because it might be the case that the tribal chief would have a rival from within the ranks of his own tribe. Some ambitious warrior, some ambitious young man, some ambitious leader of another branch of the same ruling tribe would see himself as worthier of authority than his own cousin. As such, he would start conspiring against him to overthrow his rule and consolidate his own authority. So, what would the tribal chief in office do? Now, he can bribe his relative, he can put him in a position of influence, or he can simply kill him. But all these options at certain times used in order to abort the possibility of revolution would provoke internal revolution, and that would lead to the collapse of the solidarity of the tribe. The same goes for the alliance between the ruling tribe and the other tribes. There were certain measures to buy the loyalty of the chief of the other tribes, of the chiefs of the other tribes, giving them money, giving them the authority to collect taxes from other tribes, giving them positions of influence. But here we have a problem that maybe instead of satisfying their greed, instead of satisfying their desires for authority, that would encourage them to get more authority. That would allow them the chance to recruit more men, more followers, to consolidate their own authority, to build up a base for authority in order to jump against the central authority. These were all possibilities, and this is why it was an everyday occurrence, the rise of new states and the fall of old states. Every day there was a rise of a new state, that is to say, the rise of a new political regime, and the fall of another political regime. Another element that made matters worse socially and politically was that the lines of communication were extended and were actually very difficult to maintain. So if a certain ruler, a certain head of a tribal state, delegated his authority to a ruler of a certain region, he didn't really supervise the daily practice of authority in that region, and his own authority on his deputy was actually nominal, and he was away from the eyes of the central authority, that deputy. And this provided him with a very good chance to consolidate his own base of power, to collect money, to build up wealth, to build up his own army of warriors and followers. As such, is what it was a common practice for the rulers of these tribal states to humiliate their deputies by confiscating their property, by putting them in prison, by sending them to exile, or simply killing them. And sometimes, as we said before, these measures that were taken in order to preempt any possibility for a revolution provoked revolution. And as such, any deputy of a certain ruler had in his mind the project of building up an independent state. Any political unit was actually a project for a new political entity. And as such, we're always watching in this historical era the rise and fall of tribal states. One of the factors that also influenced this historical era politically and socially was the shrinking of Muslim rule in Andalusia. The shrinking of Muslim rule in Andalusia means that every day a new area, a new city, a new town was falling in the hand of Spanish Christians. And as such, the Muslim population of this city, they simply fled their homes and they crossed the sea and they moved to this or that city of Al-Maghrib Al-Kabir. This changed not only the demographic structure of these areas, but it also changed the political composition of the political courts. That is to say that among those migrants were actually poets, scientists, but also very skilled politicians. And those skilled politicians, they joined the ruling elites in the Western, the Moroccan cities. And they brought with them new customs, luxurious customs. They wanted to spend lavishly to satisfy their desires. They wanted to enjoy themselves as they used to do in their own palaces and in Andalusia. So they came and they brought with them the luxurious and expensive way of life that they used to have in Andalusia. Now that was a burden on the budget of the state. And please do not forget that the revenues that these tribal states commanded were actually limited. Now, if the ruler of a tribal state would like to enjoy the luxurious way of life of the Andalusian immigrants, that recommended to do this or recommended to do that, it means that he would have to spend more on himself and to spend less on his followers. And we said that the political stability of the tribal state depended on maintaining the internal solidarity of the ruling tribe. Maintaining the internal solidarity of the ruling tribe depended on what? Depended on distributing monetary gifts. Now, if I'm a ruler and I want to spend more on myself to enjoy myself, to satisfy my own desire, it means that I will spend more on myself and I will spend less on my followers, which will be very dissatisfactory and very distasteful to them. As such, importing the lavish and luxurious ways of life of Andalusian immigrants actually unbalanced these societies politically and socially, and they led to the break between the Sultan and his men, between the Sultan and his soldiers who formed the pillars of his rule. Now, the inevitable result for this was actually the weakness and the collapse of his authority, and opening the way for political adventures and conspiracies on that ruler who wanted to spend lavishly and live in the Andalusian fashion. Now, the last aspect of the historical context in which Ibn Khaldun was living was the intellectual or cultural aspect. Now, this was an age of social turbulence, of political chaos, of dissolution, and of fragmentation. And all these conditions are not conducive in any way to cultural flourishing, to producing knowledge, not at all. And in order to produce knowledge, in order for a culture to flourish, this needs a lot of money to be spent by rulers who encourage culture, who encourage writers to write, poets, thinkers, scientists to do their work. But that was not the case, because these states were always afraid of political adventures, always afraid of conspiracies. The tribes were always fighting one another, so death, killing, war was part of the everyday life. This kind of life does not encourage producing culture or producing knowledge at all. And this is why culturally, this was an era of stagnation. This was an era of cultural ossification and cultural retreat. For instance, Muhammad Abd al-Gabri, he says that the western part of the Muslim world witnessed great and grave retreat from the scientific and the cultural perspective. And actually, Ibn Khaldun, who was a very great historian, and he wrote history of the Muslim society, especially the western part of the Muslim world, the Maghribi societies. He wrote about the scientific aspect, and he tried to account for the historical flourishing and the historical ossification and retreat of the different branches of knowledge. So he observed this phenomenon firsthand. For instance, in the religious fields of knowledge, the sciences of the Quran and the prophetic tradition, we find that the people actually didn't go to the classical works in order to revise them and review them, but instead they kept reading summaries and summaries of summaries. This is something that you must see in your own times, in your own days. People do not like to read books. They prefer to do other things. They are easily bored, or they lack the intellectual capacity to read classical works, so they resort for summaries. They want everything sharp and short. They do not want to go in deep about what they are reading. This is happening in our era, which is not a very flourishing era culturally, and this was taking place in the time of Ibn Khaldun, whether we're talking about the Quranic sciences, whether we're talking about the prophetic tradition, whether we're talking about the legal sciences, ilm al-fiqh. The same actually goes for the rational sciences like logic and philosophy. So the works of the previous philosophers like Al-Kindi, Al-Farabi, and Ibn Sina, these works were actually abandoned, and most of the people actually didn't care about studying philosophy or studying logic. There was this ruler who was living at the time of Ibn Rushd, and he burnt the books of philosophy. There was this famous faqih, Ibn Salah, who issued a fatwa against philosophy. when he was saying الفلسفة أس السفه والانحلال ومادة الحيرة والضلال. One of his famous statements was من تفلسف تزندق، من تمنطق، عفوا، من تمنطق تزندق. تمنطق أي درس المنطق أو اشتغل بالمنطق، تزندق أي خرج عن الدين. We find that this kind of Sufism, ritualistic Sufism, shawaza with dagal, the use of magic was spread in these societies. The kind of mythical and magical way of thinking spread among the inhabitants. And although a very minor part of the population worked on classical works in religion and literature and philosophy, but they only belonged to the courts of rulers and principals, and as such they didn't have the courage to declare their own opinions or to influence the conditions at hand. That was the age of Ibn Khaldoun. That was the era in which Ibn Khaldoun was living, and we can't understand anything about the problems, about the concepts, about the notions, about the themes, about the methods that Ibn Khaldoun used, except when we know this historical background.